Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 536. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, and today is January 31st. We got a lot of news to get through on today's show. The war in Ukraine, the war in Yemen, the war in Gaza, the potential Biden response to Iran in the Middle East. So a lot of news to get through. And of course, as I've been saying all week, probably going to have another bonus show later this week just to try to keep up with the massive amount of news that I'm trying to cover on the show and keep up on. So because Biden is such a war-happy president, we're going to have a lot to say. All right, let's get into today's episode. The first thing we have today is Biden is working on a plan to prevent possible Trump cuts to Ukraine aid. Right, and I wrote this on January 29th. President Joe Biden is working on a document that would promise military assistance to Ukraine for the next decade. The White House hopes to get congressional approval and prevent Donald Trump from changing course in Ukraine if elected. With the commitment to Kiev, Biden is seeking President Zelensky to adopt a defensive position and abandon aspirations to retake territory. The Washington Post reports that the White House is working with the State Department to compile a document that will pledge short and long-term military assistance to Ukraine. The administration will seek congressional buy-in. A portion of the policy will be included in the $111 billion supplemental defense spending bill that includes $61 billion in military assistance for Ukraine. So this is a quote from the Washington Post. According to U.S. defense officials, the American document will guarantee support for the short-term military operations as well as build a future Ukrainian military force that can deter Russian aggression. It will include specific promises and programs to help protect, reconstitute, and expand Ukraine's industrial and export base and assist the country with political reforms needed for integration into Western institutions. Not incidentally, U.S. officials say the hope is that the long-term promise will also, quote, future-proof. That's the, I guess the word that the administration officials used, the U.S. official used to the Washington Post, aid for Ukraine against the possibility that former President Trump wins his re-election bid. Now, I think this is problematic for a couple of reasons. The first is that if Trump runs on a policy of ending the war in Ukraine and the American people elect Donald Trump, then that's the policy that the American people want. And some dictator like Joe Biden can't say that that policy cannot be changed. And so that's problematic for a reason. But the White House doesn't care what the people want. There's a recent question in the White House. I want to say it was not the White House press briefing room. I don't think it was asked to Kirby. I think it was asked to Matthew Miller at the State Department. And he's the State Department spokesperson. And Miller was asked, is the Biden administration looking at 2024 polling to make his decision? And they say, no, the president doesn't consider that, which is one thing to think about, right? That and maybe even your initial instinct is, good, the president isn't basing all of his current decision-making on 2024 polling. However, the U.S. is waging undeclared wars in the Middle East and Yemen and against, whatever we call the axis of resistance, what the U.S. government likes to call the Iran-backed groups in the Middle East, with no congressional authorization, no congressional funding. And so if the American people are against fighting additional wars, that is something that Biden should take into consideration, but won't, because he cares more about Israel than he does the American people. All right, so back to my article here. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Trump started to criticize Biden for failing to prevent the war. Trump claimed that if elected, he will be able to end the conflict within days of taking office. It is unclear how Trump plans to accomplish this. As president, he significantly escalated tensions with Russia in Ukraine by providing Kiev with lethal arms. While the Biden White House cannot ensure that his predecessor does not alter Ukraine policy, last year, the Wall Street Journal explained that a significant number of pro-war hawks in Congress will create roadblocks for policy change. And so here is what the White House's plan is they want to establish and put it into law that we have to support Ukraine. That way, if Trump decides to change that policy, he would have to get approval from Congress. And it would probably essentially tied Trump's hands like Biden felt his hands were tied on like the Iran deal issue, where it would, to get congressional approval to restart the Iran nuclear deal was going to be very difficult / not happen because, even the Hawks in the Democrat Party in Congress didn't want that. And so, it may be a somewhat effective strategy here, especially because, as we saw from Trump's first term, he's not that good at navigating, particularly the Pentagon bureaucracy. He, even if you agree with some of the instincts that Trump has to avoid wars, he's unable to implement those policies and either end wars or, get his people to withdraw troops from countries that he doesn't want his troops in. So, additionally, the White House is pushing Zelensky to forego an offensive operations this year. The Washington Post reports the Biden administration is putting together a new strategy that will de-emphasize winning bad territory and focus instead on helping Ukraine fend off new Russian advances while moving towards a long-term goal of strengthening its fighting force and economy. The emerging plan is a sharp contrast from last year when the U.S. and allied militaries rushed training and sophisticated equipment to Kiev in hopes that it could quickly push back Russian occupying forces in eastern and southern Ukraine. That effort foundered largely on Russia's heavily fortified minefields and frontline trenches. In the early months of the war, Kiev's Western backers pledged to support Ukraine for as long as it takes and pushed Zelensky to abandon a potential agreement with Russia. Nearly 2 years into the war, the White House has depleted its funds to arm Ukraine, and Western stockpiles are running low. In Ukraine, Kiev's weapons depots are also depleted, and under-equipped soldiers are struggling to push back advancing Russian forces. Now, one thing I will add to this, and these do seem to just be rumors at this point, although this morning I saw on the BBC that they report that there was some Western interference here, and so it does seem to confirm the story that earlier this week, the Ukrainian President Zelensky tried to fire the Ukrainian chief of military, Zaluzhny. Now, I think the reason this is important is these two men reflect different objectives for the war. While Zaluzhny has I think, far more reasonable objective, which is, to play defense here and to not lose any more territory and to realize the situation on the ground. Ukraine lacks man, they lack ammunition, they lack training, their soldiers are way too old, the average age is in the mid-40s, and so all these are real problems. But Zelensky, the president, keeps saying that Ukraine is going to take back all of its territory, including, not only the territory seized by Russia since February of 2022, but also the separatist areas of the Donbass, the Donetsk republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, and then also the Crimean Peninsula, which is just absurd. Now, throughout this war, the White House has pledged and said that however this war gets decided, it's on Kiev to decide how that happens. It's Zelensky's decision. And now they're saying they're going to pressure Zelensky, which I think is also problematic because for a long time, anybody who said the U.S. should pressure Zelensky to engage in talks to bring an end to this war because there's not a path forward for Ukraine was called a Russian propagandist and said, oh, you just want Putin to win this war. Now it's the White House policy after they smeared all of us for all this time. All right, next up here, NATO chief visits U.S. to push for Ukraine aid. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is in the U.S. this week to push Congress to pass a massive $61 billion aid package for Ukraine proposed by the White House. The supplemental defense spending bill has been stalled in Congress for several months. In an effort to appeal to Republicans, the civilian NATO head attempted to tie the war in Ukraine to Taiwan's security. During a press conference in the U.S. with Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Monday, Stoltenberg said, "It would be a tragedy for Ukrainians if President Putin wins, but it would also make the world more dangerous and not all of us more secure. It will embolden authoritarian leaders, not only President Putin, but also North Korea, Iran, China to use force. Today it is Ukraine, tomorrow it could be Taiwan." On Tuesday, Stoltenberg will meet with congressional leaders, including House Speaker Mike Johnson, Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. Politico reports that the NATO chief will visit the Heritage Foundation on Wednesday to pitch to Trump-tied Republicans on approving more Ukraine aid. Republicans in Congress and the White House have been negotiating the $111 billion supplemental defense bill for several months. The Biden administration attempted to sway Republicans to pass aid for Ukraine by tying funding for military assistance to Israel, Taiwan, and the border security. The plan backfired as Republicans leveraged aid to Ukraine to get Biden to make concessions regarding immigration policy. A resolution appears unlikely in the near term, as former President Donald Trump denounced the bipartisan proposal that emerged earlier this month. And so it did seem like there was a compromise coming out, but I guess at least from Trump's position, well, all right, so there's a couple things. The stated Trump position is that it's not good enough on the border. It's possible that Trump sees, a non-resolution to the supplemental bill to the immigration problem as beneficial for his re-election campaign, and just, is deciding that it's better to kick the ball down the road, wait till he's president, and then, he could claim that he dealt with all this and fixed all these problems. So it could be one of those things. It didn't seem like the Republicans were getting a particularly good deal from their perspective on the border before Trump said this. So I don't know. I guess, while I'm not necessarily very interested in the border debate, I do find it pretty interesting here how this is all playing out, and especially how it's impacting Ukraine aid and also aid to Israel and Taiwan, which are all things I oppose. All right, next up here. European Union plans to sabotage Hungary's economy if Orban blots Ukraine aid. So this from Dave DeCamp, January 30th, antiwar.com. The EU is planning to sabotage Hungary's economy if Hungarian President Viktor Orban blots a 50 billion euro aid package to Ukraine at the Summit of European Leaders that will happen on Thursday, and this was in a Financial Times article from Monday. The plan has been outlined by EU officials in a document obtained by the Financial Times, and it looks to exploit Hungary's economic weaknesses, hurt its currency, scare off investors, and hurt jobs and growth in the country. If Orban doesn't lift his veto of Ukraine aid, the European Union plan to cut off all funding to Hungary. Without that funding, the document says, financial markets and European international companies might be less interested in investing in Hungary. That could quickly trigger a further increase in the cost of funding of the public deficit and drop in the currency. The European Union diplomat speaking to the Financial Times admitted that the plan to pressure Hungary is, quote, blackmail. In response to the report, Hungary's envoy to the European Union said Budapest doesn't give in to pressure and will continue to negotiate on the issue. Hungary is trying to establish a connection between the support for Ukraine and assistance to the European Union funds and reject other parties in doing so. And this is all very complicated. There's a lot that goes into it. Hungary, of course, is the only country that hasn't approved Sweden's NATO membership, and so there's pressure on Budapest in that direction. There's also the fact that Ukraine used to export a lot of its, wheats and farm products through the Black Sea region and out, and, a lot of it went to Africa and other places around the world. But the war in Ukraine has made so that those exports can't go through the Black Sea, and now a lot of those exports are leaving through Ukraine's bordering nations. And so Poland, Hungary, and a lot of these other countries have had some real problems, even if it's not at the governmental level like Orban is addressing it. In Poland, there's a massive trucker protest on the border with Ukraine. I think, at one point, pretty recently, it was like 20 miles long. The trucks were refusing to move and refusing to prevent, trucks from getting back into Ukraine with the idea that this would slow up them bringing goods back, which are hurting the Polish, particularly farmers and truckers, I believe. So there's a lot of issues in this region, and Hungary has a lot of issues not to cave on this issue. I'm not sure if they will or how this is going to play out. All right, next up here. North Korea tests cruise missiles blast U.S. and South Korea for joint war games. So North Korea slammed the U.S. and South Korea for inching the peninsula towards the brink of war with a series of war games. After Pyongyang issued the statement, North Korea test-fired several cruise missiles. In a fiery statement published on North Korean state media on Sunday, Pyongyang warned Washington and Seoul of ruthless punishments if war broke out. The statement highlighted 5 military drills between the U.S., South Korea, and some involving Japan that were conducted earlier this month. Pyongyang argued that war games involving strategic weapon systems, which, are capable of delivering nuclear weapons, are highly provocative. So this is part of the statement published in KCNA, which is North Korean state media. The current situation in which frantic nuclear war drills are being staged against the DPRK from the onset of the new year requires the DPRK to be fully prepared for war and thoroughly deter the U.S. and stooges invasion with overwhelming power. We showed on various occasions that our cutting-edge military hardware are not for demonstration and legalized the Korean-style nuclear doctrine on use of nuclear forces long ago. North Korea also conducted its third major missile test of the year on Sunday. So I think by my count, North Korea has conducted about 6 missile tests this year. A couple of them only involved firing a few short-range missiles. So those haven't gotten as much attention, but there was an test of an intercontinental ballistic missile and an earlier test of, I believe, some intermediate range cruise missiles that were pretty major tests and drew responses, particularly responses from the West. So North Korea state media reported Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un expressed the prevailing situation and the future threats of the DPRK to put more spurs to the effort of defending maritime security. And then he was involved in the test launch of a submarine-launched strategic cruise missile dubbed Polosi 3-31. Earlier this month, Pyongyang tested an intercontinental ballistic missile and a previous cruise missile test. So those are, the major tests. North Korea's aggressive rhetoric and missile tests come as tensions on the Korean peninsula are a multi-year high. U.S. President Joe Biden and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol have engaged in a military buildup in the region that has enraged Kim. Washington has deployed several weapon systems capable of delivering a nuclear strike to the region. American and South Korean forces conducted war games simulating the decapitation of the North Korean state. U.S. and North Korea watchers believe conflict could break out soon. However, other observers, such as John Pfeffer, have noted that in the past, aggressive behavior from Pyongyang generated discussions with Washington. While seemingly contradictory, missile tests and threats generate concerns among the American public and put pressure on the White House to engage with Kim, where typically the White House would rather just ignore that North Korea is a country that the U.S. is still at war with and has been for several decades. All right, let's start here when it comes to the Israel-Palestine stuff. We have a lot. Israel killed Palestinians holding white flag and following evacuation orders. So this is from Al Jazeera. On the morning of Wednesday, January 24th, the Bar Bakts were getting ready to leave the Al Amal, an area west of Khan Yunis, and move further south as they had been ordered to do by leaflets dropped on their neighborhood the day before and by announcements made from an Arabic language spokesperson for the Israeli army. We don't know what to do, the boy's mother told Al Jazeera. In the beginning, we weren't even sure about these evacuation orders because we hadn't seen them ourselves. We were trying to lay low in our house and keep everybody safe. But finally, that we realized that we would have to go and start trying to come up with a plan. My husband and sons thought maybe we could break a rear wall and go out that way because we could hear that there was firing outside. Eventually, though, the couple decided that the best way was the most direct. They would walk out of their house holding white flags and make their way to the Al Mawasi as directed. I called over, I called Naela over. I gave him a white cloth to hold above his head as a white flag. I thought there was no way anybody would want to hurt a child or to be scared of a child. And so I believe this boy was either 13 or 20. I got a little confused when I was reading it. There's a 13-year-old and a 20-year-old that get killed here. So as the rest of the family bundling together the last of their belongings they thought they could take with them, he walked and took a few cautious steps out of the front door, waving the white flag over his head and walking cautiously out to the corner so he could look at the main road to see which way the family would go. As he took a few steps out the door, he was shot in the legs and fell to the ground. His father called on him from without in the house's doorway, coaxing his little boy to get up, but get up bit by bit and just tried to get back into the house. But when he tried to get back into the house, he was shot twice more, once in the back and once in the head. His brother, 18 years old, told Al Jazeera that the shooting was coming from the direction of about 1,000 feet away in an area where Sanad was able to confirm that the Israeli military was active on the day in question. Seeing what had happened to his little brother, Ramirez ran out of the house and tried to pull him out of harm's way. So this is the 20-year-old. The first boy that got shot was 13. He was shot in the heart and fell on his stricken brother, white flag and all. The family could not approach the bodies and eventually had to flee the neighborhood without knowing what came of them. And so imagine, I can't even imagine, and probably you can't either, but try to think of this situation where you're a family, right? And, there's maybe 8 of you, and you send the 13-year-old out with the white flag, holding it above his head. He's not only killed, but shot twice in his legs first, almost as a way to try to bait out the rest of the family to rush out to come help them so they could shoot him. And when, rather than doing that, they try to coax him back inside because they understand that this will result in them dead, they just go ahead and finish him off with shots to the heart and the head. And then when his slightly older brother runs outside to recover his body, they just go ahead and execute him right there on the spot. And then the rest of the family is stuck there looking at, these 2 family members of theirs, which I'm sure they are able to tell are dead. And I'm sure they want to give their family members a funeral and everything like that. But they also understand that the pile of bodies on their front door is just going to get bigger the more people that walk out and try to help their dead brothers there and, try to give them some kind of proper burial or anything like that. And so they just have to leave them. I mean, this is unreal what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And yet White House just doesn't have any problem with it. At least that's what they're saying publicly. All right, next up here. Israeli military conducts assassinations inside West Bank hospital. Israeli soldiers dressed as women in medics infiltrated the Ibn Shia hospital in the West Bank and conducted 3 assassinations. The Israeli soldiers opened fire in the hospital ward to kill the Palestinians. The Associated Press reports the Israeli military said the militants were using the hospital as a hideout without providing evidence. Footage said to be security camera video from the hospital that has circulated on social media shows about a dozen undercover forces, most of them armed, dressed as women with Muslim headscarves, or hospital staff in scrubs or white doctor's coats. One in a surgical mask carried a rifle in one arm and folded in a wheelchair in the other, and the forces were seen patting down one man kneeled against the wall, his arms raised. And so, the problem here, and the State Department, by the way, the State Department has come out and said that they do not have an issue with Israel carrying out an armed operation in a hospital. It is unreal, especially when, it seems that they could have gone in and made arrests here. The fact that they went in and just executed people is, I think, a sign to the Palestinians that, they want all of you dead. All right, another real sign here of the Israeli genocide in Gaza is this: Israel fails to produce evidence to justify widespread cemetery destruction in Gaza. So I wrote this one for the Institute on January 30th. The Israeli military granted CNN a 3-hour tour inside the Gaza Strip to view the destruction of Palestinian cemeteries. The outlet explained that the evidence presented by the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, did not confirm Tel Aviv's claims that there are tunnels under the graveyard. Across Gaza, Israel has damaged over a dozen cemeteries. An IDF general gave CNN's Jeremy Diamond a guided tour of the Banani Shulia cemetery. Israel claimed it needed to dig up the bodies buried at the graveyard because Hamas tunnel ran under it. However, the IDF was unable to show CNN of evidence supporting the claim. And look, this was a fairly large graveyard. Now it's a huge pit. Who knows what happened to the bodies that were there, the gravestones and all of that. I guess they're just, probably in the pile of rubble that Israel will end up just burying somewhere and, give no thought to the rest of the dead there. Diamond explained the evidence presented by the IDF actually suggested there was no tunnel beneath the cemetery. And so imagine you invite CNN, U.S. near state media, on a 3-hour guided tour from an English-speaking, no Israeli accent, like perfect American accent, IDF general gives CNN a 3-hour tour, and CNN walks away from that tour completely unconvinced by everything that they were trying to convince them of. And not only is this not some minor issue, this is the widespread and systematic destruction of cemeteries in Gaza, and the widespread and systematic destruction of cemeteries is certainly an indication that Israel is trying to carry out a genocide in Gaza. So the IDF invited Diamond into Gaza after he reported the Israeli military operations in Gaza had destroyed 16 Gazan cemeteries. Palestinian officials report that at least 2,000 graves in the strip have been damaged or destroyed by the Israeli military. Jania Dill, the co-director of Oxford University's Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict, told CNN that the destruction of the burial sites could be evidence of genocide. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, ruled this week that it was plausible that Israelis were committing genocide against Palestinians. Throughout the Israeli war on Gaza, Tel Aviv has attempted to justify destroying civilian infrastructure by claiming that below the buildings, Hamas had dug tunnels. Similar to the cemetery, the IDF has been able to produce conclusive evidence that the tunnel networks have existed. Still, Washington has not condemned the destruction of hospitals, cemeteries, and universities. The White House has even repeated Israel's unproven claims regarding the tunnels. President Joe Biden backed the assertion that the Shifa hospital was above a Hamas headquarters, which again, even the Washington Post said that ain't true. They looked at it, they went there, they saw the evidence that the IDF had, and they said there isn't a command center under that hospital. There was no excuse to destroy that hospital. Still, the U.S. has nothing to say about it. Additionally, State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller suggested the IDF conducted a controlled demolition of a university in Gaza because there were tunnels underneath the building. No proof of that. Israel didn't even say it, but the U.S. just assumes that anything Israel is doing bad in Gaza must be because of Hamas, and so they're just going to repeat the Israeli propaganda without even having to be told. All right. So with all that, right, you would assume that Israel's largest backer, the United States, would maybe be interested in trying to rein this in a little bit, at least to some extent prevent the horrors that Israel is committing in Gaza. But that is not the case. So this one from Dade to Camp, January 29th, antiwar.com. White House denies report that it is considering leveraging military aid to Israel. The White House on Sunday dismissed a report from NBC News that said President Biden was considering leveraging military aid to Israel to pressure Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to scale down the violence in Gaza. The report said the White House asked the Pentagon to review what weapons could be used as leverage and that no decisions have been made. But in response to the report, the White House said that it has not changed its policy of unconditional support for the mass killings of Palestinians in Gaza. This is a quote from an unnamed National Security Council spokesperson, probably John Kirby, but who knows. Israel has a right and obligation to defend themselves against the threat of Hamas while abiding by the international humanitarian law and protecting civilian lives. And we remain committed to support Israel in the fight against Hamas. We had done so since October 7th and will continue to. There has not been a change in our policy. And so, to say that Israel needs to fight Hamas while abiding by international humanitarian law, and then you had the ICJ, an international court, rule that it's plausible that Israel is violating those international laws, the U.S. still has nothing to say about. In fact, they say, the ICJ is just wrong. The U.S. and Israeli officials recently met in Washington to advance several major arms deals that will arm Israel with F-35s, F-15s, and Apache helicopters. Israel will procure 25 F-35s under the agreement that will be paid for by $3 billion in U.S. military aid. So that's right. All of us are going to pay so Israel could have 25 F-35s to slaughter the Palestinians at will. Where the funding for the F-15s and Apaches will come from is unclear, but the U.S. is trying to give an additional $14 billion in military aid on top of the $3.8 billion the country receives every year, so maybe it'll come from that. Dave notes here, since October 7th, the U.S. has shipped Israel over 25,000 tons of weapons to support the Israeli slaughter in Gaza, according to Ynet, an Israeli outlet. In that time, over 26,000 Palestinians have been killed, including over 10,000 children. The U.S. has dismissed the ICJ ruling that said it's plausible that Israel is committing a genocide. And so even with all those weapons, the fight doesn't seem to be going particularly well for the Israelis, as far as, their stated goal or their claimed goal of taking out Hamas. This one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Israel struggles to destroy Hamas tunnels. U.S. and Israeli officials believe about 80% of Hamas's tunnel under the Gaza Strip are still intact after over 3 months of Israeli relentless bombing, the Wall Street Journal reported on Sunday. The report said that the report is another sign that Netanyahu's goal of wanting to eradicate Hamas is unrealistic, as the tunnels are part of the group's infrastructure. The Israeli newspaper Haaretz recently reported that sources within the IDF said they knew it would be unable to destroy most of the Hamas tunnels that are underground, and that the underground network is significantly larger than recently thought. According to the New York Times, Israel previously believed there were about 100 miles of tunnels below Gaza. They now estimate the tunnel network is 450 miles in length. Israel has flooded some of the tunnels with water, but the strategy was not as effective as they hoped. U.S. officials told the journal that in some areas, unexpected barriers slowed or stopped the flow of water altogether. Another problem, of course, with the water is the environmental damage. So if, the Israelis were ever allowing the Palestinians to return to Gaza, not only would this destroy the aquifers below Gaza, but could also destroy the farmland and prevent crops from growing. There are also signs that the Israeli military has flooded some tunnels with poison gas. The bodies of 3 Israeli hostages were found in Hamas tunnels by the Israeli military, and the mother of one of those victims alleges they were killed by Israeli forces pumping in poison gas, and she cited a toxicology report. She even put this on her boy's headstone, that he was killed by the Israeli military with poison gas. And so it does seem like, she's probably right that that's what happened there. And the Israelis haven't explicitly denied it either, which has been interesting. All right, next up here, Hamas reasserting control over areas in northern Gaza. Hamas militants have returned to northern Gaza and are mobilizing against Israeli forces and establishing a system of governance, The Guardian reported on Tuesday, citing Israeli officials, Gaza residents, and aid officials. We are hearing more, unfortunately, of the recovery of an insurgency in both central and northern Gaza. We are hearing more and more that Hamas are doing policing in North Gaza and governing trade, and that's a very bad outcome, said a former Israeli national security advisor. The Israeli military recently withdrew from some areas in the northern Gaza Strip and claimed it had taken out Hamas's military structure in the area, saying only pockets of resistance were left. But the re-emergence of an organized Hamas members in the area highlighted the Palestinians' group resilience and the unrealistic nature of Netanyahu's goal of eradicating Hamas. And so, for people watching this show, we have a map up here. Areas of red are areas of Gaza that are at least uncontrolled by the Israeli military. I guess it could be maybe questionable if those are all controlled by Hamas. The Guardian quoted Michael Milston, the Institute of National Security Studies, an Israeli-based think tank, who said Hamas had survived the Israeli brutal bombing campaign and ground operations in the north. He said, Hamas controls these areas. There is no chaos or vacuum because it is the workers of Hamas's municipality or civilian rescue defense forces who are effectively a part of Hamas who are enforcing public order. Hamas still exists. Hamas has survived. And so what he's pointing out is that it's not just that there's, some Hamas fighters walking around on the streets of northern Gaza, but it's really the structure, the political structure of Hamas that has come back to these areas and are kind of trying to restore order, maybe rescue some civilians. There's a report that what happens when people start to starve, when any aid truck enters Gaza, that aid truck is going to get mobbed. This happens anywhere that there's widespread starvation, and so this could help order out the, how some of the aid is distributed. The official continued, the IDF version is that the northern part of Gaza is basic military structure of Hamas was broken, that only works with conventional army, but now with the flexible guerrilla operations like Hamas. We are already seeing individual snipers setting booby traps and so on. Israel has also struggled to destroy Hamas's underground tunnel network, and in that Guardian article, there's a note at the end from an official who says that, look, one of the problems that Israel is going to have is they've killed so many civilians in Gaza that Hamas is going to have no problem replenishing their ranks and finding new recruits at this point in time. All right, so the fighting in Gaza could continue into 2025. Bloomberg reports the intelligence officer said Israel is still many months away from achieving its goals, which include capturing or destroying munitions and weapons and rendering Hamas military bases and tunnels inoperative. According to that, accomplishing that will take all of 2024 and perhaps longer, he said. In addition, the command structure of the two remaining Hamas brigades, one in the center and the other in the southern city of Rafah, are still intact. Each brigade is led by 70 and 150 commanders, and killing or capturing them is vital to dismantling these units. With Israel's military developing a clear picture of Hamas and its infrastructure, former National Security Advisor Yaakov Admor said that officials now know that most of the organization's weapons produced in Gaza are not smuggled in. They are more advanced and bigger than we realize, he said of the armaments. And one of the things we recently talked about on the show about how Hamas is arming themselves is that a lot of these arms are coming from Israeli weapons that were left on the ground. Unexploded ordnances that Israel has fired into Gaza over the years. And so they then, take those weapons, break them down, and turn them into anti-tank weapons and things like that. All right, next up, an article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on January 29th. Human rights officials warn aid cuts make famine in Gaza inevitable. Several human rights officials are warning that the U.S. and other countries suspending support for the Palestinian UAID aid agency will be catastrophic for the people of Gaza. The Israeli war and blockades placed on Gaza have the Strip on the brink of famine and widespread death. The U.S. and several other countries cut aid to the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, so that's UNRWA, after Israel alleged a small number of low-level staff members participated in the October 7th attack. On Sunday, Michael Fakari, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, posted on X, some states decided to defund UNWRA for the allegations of a small number of employees. This collectively punishes the 2.2 million Palestinians. Famine was imminent, now it's inevitable. On Friday, Israel informed UNRWA that 12 of its staff members had participated in the October 7th attack on southern Israel. A senior Israeli official said a lot of the intelligence is from interrogations of militants who were arrested during the October 7th attack. The allegations generated from the intelligence obtained during interrogations of Palestinians could be problematic. Since October 7th, Israel has engaged in widespread campaigns of arrest of Palestinians. Once in detention, Palestinians are subjected to well-documented sexual abuse, humiliations, beating, and torture. The brutal conditions in Israeli prisons have killed some detainees. And so, this could be an awful like some of the intelligence that the Bush administration generated from Guantanamo Bay. Sure, they could get some Hamas militant to say that, some people took part in this, that UNRWA took part in this raid, but it doesn't make it true. UNRWA Secretary General Felipe Lazare took immediate action by firing the accused staff member. Still, the Joe Biden administration elected to halt aid transfers to the organization. Additionally, Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz said UNRWA should be removed from Gaza once Tel Aviv ends its military operations in the Strip. On Sunday, Lazare warned that if aid transfers are not restarted, UNRWA will have to suspend operations. I urge countries who have suspended their funding to reconsider their decisions before UNRWA is forced to suspend its humanitarian response. The lives of the people of Gaza depend on this support, and so does regional stability. Reports from Gaza explain Palestinians are eating rotten food, stray dogs, and animal feed to survive. A spokeswoman for UNRWA said future aid deliveries are in jeopardy. I don't know how long we can continue. It's not a perfect science, but right now our operations are in serious jeopardy. We will continue to deliver humanitarian assistance for as long as we can, but under the current circumstances, that's going to be difficult to do. The UNRWA's largest backer is the U.S. The agency is in charge of nearly all UN aid shipments into Gaza. Since October 7th, Israel has severely restricted the delivery of aid into Gaza. The war has displaced around 2 million Palestinians and destroyed much of the Strip's medical facilities, creating a dramatically increased need for aid. Before the war, nearly half of Gazans were dependent on UNRWA support. Helen Harara, a worker at a Dutch NGO, fears the cuts will cause disastrous situation. This will be a catastrophic situation. If UNRWA shuts down, it will make the situation so much worse. Even before this news, there were huge limits on the aid entering Gaza. Medical Sans Frontiers, or Doctors Without Borders, explained that if countries UNRWA, that if the aid is not restored, UNRWA is a lifeline for Palestinians, and without funding, death and suffering will increase in Gaza. The MSF statement said, in the Gaza Strip, the humanitarian crisis has reached catastrophic levels, and in any additional limitations on aid will result in more deaths and suffering. Humanitarian organizations are already grappling to meet even a fraction of the urgent needs in Gaza. Much more aid is required to meet those needs, not less. All right. Moving on here is an article from The Intercept at New York Times. Furious internal debate about strength of reporting on sexual assaults during October 7th Hamas attack is ongoing. The Intercept reports, the New York Times pulled a high-profile episode of its podcast, The Daily, about sexual violence preparations by Hamas on October 7th, amid a furious internal debate about the strength of the paper's original reporting on the subject. The Times newsroom sources told The Intercept that the episode had been scheduled for release on January 9th and was based on the prominent article by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Jeffrey Gettleman, claiming that Hamas has systematically used sexual violence as a weapon of war. As a criticism of Gettleman's stories grew both internally and externally, producers at The Daily shelved the original script and paused the episode. According to the newsroom, sources familiar with the process, a new script was drafted, one that offered major caveats, allowed for uncertainty, and asked open-ended questions that were absent from the original article, which presented its findings as definitive evidence for the systematic use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. That new draft remains the subject of significant controversy and has yet to be aired on the flagship podcast. The producers and the paper of record find themselves in a jam. Run a version that hews closely to the previously published story and risk republishing serious mistakes, or publish a heavily toned down version, raising questions whether the paper still stands by their original report. Meanwhile, sources at the time say Gettleman has been assigned a follow-up to gather evidence supporting his original reporting. The internal critics worry that the article is another caliphate-level journalistic debacle. There seems to be no self-awareness at the top, one frustrated Times editorial staffer said. The story deserves more fact-checking and much more reporting, all basis standards applied to other countless stories. The critics have highlighted major discrepancies in the accounts presented by the Times, subsequent public comments from the family and major subjects of the article denouncing it, and comments from a key witness seeming to contradict a claim attributed to him in the article. The dissent within the Times comes as the paper is also facing serious external scrutiny for its coverage of Israel's war on Gaza. Since October 7th, the New York Times has shown deference to the IDF sources while diminishing the scale and death and destruction in Palestine. An Intercept analysis found that in the first 6 weeks of the war, the New York Times, along with other major publications, consistently delegitimized Palestinian deaths and cultivate a gross imbalance in the coverage of to pro-Israeli sources and voices. The paper's coverage of South Africa's charges of genocide at the International Court of Justice played down the severity of the case at the onset and downplayed Israel's defeat on Friday. Just last week, the Times ran a headline touting the decline of deaths in Gaza, which doesn't at all reflect the situation in Gaza. It doesn't look like this is going to be resolved anytime soon. There are negotiations ongoing. I see reports every day of, the Israeli side proposed something, the other side proposed something. It doesn't look like anything has a whole lot of legs at this point. Dave DeCamp wrote yesterday for antiwar.com. Netanyahu says he won't withdraw from Gaza for new hostage deal. Maybe, this is just the negotiating process and we're working closer to something here, but I haven't seen any signs of that yet. All right, 2 more stories here today. We got a lot, so a couple more stories I think I got to talk about here. U.S. troops in Iraq on standby to support Israel's war in Gaza. The Intercept reports U.S. Air Force personnel obtained a memo, and then they gave that to the Intercept, somebody did, and describing military orders to be on standby for deployment to support troops in the case of a U.S. ground involvement in the Israel-Hamas war. According to a separate personnel document, the standby order related to personnel deployed last year to Iraq. While documents do not suggest the U.S. military ground involvement in the war is forthcoming, the January memo is the latest intimation of the Pentagon's preparations to support Israel in the wake of Hamas's October 7th attack. Days after the attack, the U.S. military reportedly put 2,000 troops to prepare to deploy orders for potential support to Israel, though from neighboring countries, orders that were confirmed by procurement document attained by the Intercept. So, they're saying that all these troops in the region are being told that you have to be ready to go to Israel to help them fight, which, is extremely problematic since they're conducting a genocide. Israeli defense minister says troops will go into action very soon in Lebanon. Efforts by the U.S. to head off Israelis' war in southern Lebanon, a conflict U.S. military intelligence has warned Israel may be unable to handle, may soon be failing, as Israel's defense minister Gallant is telling troops the offensive will start very soon. Gallant made the comments while visiting Israeli troops in the Gaza Strip, the other open-ended military offensive in which Israel has mired itself. Gallant tried to spin the Lebanon offensive as reinforcing the troops in the north. His comments came after Israel's military chief predicted conflict in Lebanon was very likely in the coming months, and after the northern military command said that tens of thousands of troops were ready for the offensive. Israel has been in a tit-for-tat strikes with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon for several months, and top Israeli politicians seem to be spoiling for yet another fight, downplaying the U.S. military's assessment that 2 fronts at the same time would stretch Israel dangerously thin. So I think what Israel assumes here is that if they go to war with Hezbollah in the north, the U.S. will get involved, and that will bail them out from being stretched too thin. Israel does seem like they want to do this, and while it seems kind of stupid on the military strategic side and with their main backer in the U.S. telling them not to, I think at this point the Israeli government sees war as just the best thing that they could be doing, not just for Netanyahu, but also for the situation overall for the Israeli leaders, not for the people, but the wide consensus in Israel, I think, is for more war. Report: drone that hit U.S. base in Jordan followed an American drone. And so It seems that the reason that this particular drone got through and wasn't shot down by air defense systems is that this drone was approaching the U.S. base at around the same time that an actual U.S. drone was approaching the U.S. base. We're talking about the drone that killed the 3 U.S. troops in Jordan, by the way. I do believe that happened just on the Jordanian side of the border, not on the Syrian side of the border. I know people are making a big deal out of it. Essentially, the U.S. has erased the border around Al-Tanf anyways. And so, legally there may be a difference because the U.S. has been invited into Jordan and not Syria, but the American people don't care that we're occupying Syria. We've been there for a decade. So, we know that, the 3 troops were killed, and that apparently it happened because the drone was approaching. Now, I do have a question about, maybe the Shia militias of Iraq were just doing this for the publicity and not necessarily for actually trying to kill American forces. Katbli Hezbollah, one of the main Shia militias in Iraq, announced it was suspending operations against U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria. Now, this group could be saying that we're really worried about how the U.S. is going to respond. We don't want to be wiped down, so that's why they're doing this. Maybe they're doing it because they were pressured by the Iranian government or the Iraqi government. It could also be that they really didn't anticipate having this major of an escalation, that this drone just happened to get through because of a situational mishap, and now they're looking to de-escalate the situation that way. I'm not sure it matters. Biden says he's decided on how he's going to respond to the drone attack, although we still haven't seen that response. I don't want to get into too much more speculation about it at this point, but I think we're likely going to see attacks against Iranian forces in Iraq and Syria. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I'll again probably have another bonus show out this week. I'll be back on with the judge tomorrow, Thursday. That'll be February 1st at 2 p.m. Eastern time. So check it out there. I'm sure me and the judge will be talking about a lot of this stuff as well. And, keep an eye on antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, because we'll have all the most important news when it breaks. Thanks, everyone.